Welcome to today's inspiring story. If you love stories about justice, cherished memories, and the courage to stand up against injustice, don't forget to like, share this video to spread a positive message, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more heartfelt stories. Every bit of support from you is the motivation we need to keep telling meaningful stories for those who still believe in what's good and right. Now, let's dive into the journey of Edward and the car that changed an entire community. Willow Glen in early autumn possessed a beauty that bordered on perfection. Brilliant red maple trees lined the neatly paved streets, their leaves drifting gently to the ground like the soft sighs of time. Lawns were trimmed to precise uniformity, and white picket fences wrapped around each home like carefully measured embraces. Everything here was maintained according to a strict standard, a standard upheld by an invisible but highly effective force, the Homeowners Association, or HOA. They governed every minute detail, from the color of porch paint to the length of front yard grass, and most importantly, the overall aesthetic harmony of the entire neighborhood. Amid this picture of pristine order, there was one house at the end of Magnolia Street that stood out, not because it was strikingly different, but because it carried a soul that the other homes seemed to have long forgotten. That house belonged to Edward Blake, a man in his 60s with neatly cropped silver hair and deep gray eyes that held a quiet, weathered stillness. Edward was a retired aerospace engineer who had spent his life working with metal, engines, and storm-chasing aircraft. But ever since his wife, Margaret, passed away 3 years ago, he had withdrawn into the quiet of what they once called their final home. In front of Edward's garage, resting silently beneath the shade of an old tree, was a 1969 Pontiac GTO in deep moss green, a symbol of passion, memory, and a love that had been lost. It wasn't just an old car. It was the last project he and Margaret worked on together before she died of cancer. They had spent hundreds of hours in that garage, their hands greasy with oil, their laughter blending with old jazz tunes, their memories now echoing only through faded photographs and the lingering scent of her perfume on the leather seats. Edward never drove the car far. Every Sunday morning, he would simply roll it out into the driveway, sit beside it with a cup of hot coffee, and watch the morning sun dance off the polished paint he had waxed by hand. It was his sacred time, a moment to connect with the past, with his beloved wife, and with the truest part of himself, a man who lived slowly, deeply, and with gratitude for every fleeting second. But that peace didn't last. In the eyes of the HOA, and more specifically, in the eyes of Karen, the woman who held the most power on the neighborhood board, the Pontiac was nothing more than a visual blight, an outdated relic, unsuited to the modern aesthetic, and a potential threat to surrounding property values if left exposed in public view. She had no interest in the story behind the aging steel. To Karen, rules were rules, no exceptions, no room for sentiment, and certainly no space for compassion in the system she upheld. And so, a cold, formal warning letter was delivered to Edward's mailbox, the beginning of a conflict that seemed trivial on the surface, but carried with it all the deepest questions about personal freedom, the value of memory, and the fine line between control and respect. Edward could have stayed silent, but as he looked at the car and then at the photo of Margaret on his desk, he knew it was time to stand up. If you've started to feel the injustice in this story and found yourself empathizing with Edward, we invite you to help us spread this message. Click like, share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next powerful story. Every bit of support from you is a voice standing with those who dare to stand up for what's right. Now, let's see what Edward decides to do when faced with a system that seems unshakable. The letter from the HOA arrived on a Monday morning, neatly folded inside a white envelope bearing the embossed emblem of the Willow Glen neighborhood in the top left corner, looking, at first glance, like an invitation to a garden party. But when Edward opened it, what he found was a formal warning, written in language as cold and sharp as steel. Violation of Clause 4.7, displaying a vehicle inconsistent with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Vehicle must be removed from the driveway within 72 hours. Beneath the statement was Karen's signature, written in deep red ink, like an inescapable verdict. Edward read it over and over, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in confusion. He had never caused any trouble. His Pontiac was always spotless, polished to a shine that surpassed even the brand new SUVs parked in his neighbors' driveways. If there was anything that made his car different, it was simply that it existed as a piece of memory, something that didn't quite fit the rigid mold of the HOA. But Karen didn't see it that way. To her, rules were the only standard, and anything that fell outside their boundaries needed to be corrected or removed. The next day, Edward attended the HOA meeting, wearing an old suit and a crisply ironed white shirt. He politely asked to speak, sharing the personal story behind the car, its meaning, and its history with the neighborhood. But Karen cut him off before he could finish. She cited the rulebook and declared, "We sympathize, but this is a modern community. With all due respect, memories cannot be used as an excuse to violate policy." A few board members nodded, not necessarily in agreement, but out of reluctance to challenge her. Edward left the meeting with a strange feeling, not rage, but disappointment. He had lived his whole life by the rules, served society, paid his taxes, been a devoted husband and father. And now, all he wanted was a small corner of peace, to preserve a love that once was. And yet, it was labeled an aesthetic burden. Back at home, he sat quietly in the garage, both hands resting on the steering wheel of the Pontiac, feeling the coolness of the metal beneath his palms. An idea flickered in his mind, faint at first, then as clear as the roar of an engine revving to life. If they couldn't see the value of the car, he would show it to the world, not with words, but through action, an action powerful enough to break the silence that had wrapped itself around the neighborhood for too long. And so, the idea for a classic car day was born, not just as a rebuttal, but as a declaration. No one has the right to smother memories under the language of authority. Edward didn't sleep that night. He sat at his old oak kitchen table, a well-worn notebook open in front of him, a notebook he usually used to sketch engine diagrams. But this time, it became the draft pad for a very different kind of plan, not a plan of anger, but of remembrance. He wouldn't file a complaint, nor would he hire a lawyer. He would fight back with something the HOA couldn't grasp, and certainly couldn't control: collective memory and community culture. The very next morning, Edward began delivering handwritten letters to each home in the neighborhood, a gesture that felt out of place in the digital age, yet somehow all the more powerful because of it. In his letter, he didn't mention Karen or the HOA. He didn't even bring up the violation notice. He simply told the story of his Pontiac, the afternoons he and his wife had spent in the garage, their hands covered in grease, their hearts light. He wrote about their first cross-country trip in 1971, about the song "Can't Help Falling in Love," playing from the car radio as Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder in the middle of the Nevada desert. He ended the letter with a heartfelt invitation. If you've ever loved a car, ever held on to something, because it reminded you of someone you could never forget, please join the Willow Glen Classic Car Day, not to prove anything, but to remember that we are people, not just entries in a rule book. Within 3 days, the silence in the neighborhood began to crack. Edward's mailbox overflowed with handwritten notes, emails, and even homemade baked goods. An elderly man, a war veteran, stopped by just to say he, too, kept his old wartime Jeep in the garage for over 40 years. A young man who had recently moved in, once warned by the HOA for hanging his family's heritage flag, volunteered to design the event's posters. And then, like an underground current rising to the surface, the residents of Willow Glen, those who had long bowed their heads to cold regulations, began to find their voices again. They shared photos of their old cars, recounted childhood memories, and posted them on the neighborhood forum. A hashtag began circulating: #Our Stories, Our Street. When Karen caught wind of the movement, she immediately issued a formal warning, claiming the event might disrupt the visual order of the community and erode the spirit of uniformity. But this time, her message didn't spark fear. It only strengthened people's resolve. For Edward, the goal was never to win or lose. Every story he received was proof that people still needed memory, still needed the freedom to preserve the things they held dear, even if it was just an old car, sitting quietly beneath the morning sun. That morning, Willow Glen didn't wake to the familiar sound of lawnmowers or the quiet hum of SUVs gliding down the street. Instead, it was stirred by the low, rumbling engines of vehicles that had once defined an era. As the sun peeked over the treetops, the road leading to the Central Park buzzed with laughter, greetings, and the steady roll of wheels on pavement, not rushed or chaotic, but ceremonious, like a parade of memory. Edward's Pontiac led the convoy. He wore an old brown leather jacket and the same cap Margaret had bought him on one of their road trips. In the passenger seat, instead of someone sitting beside him, was a carefully placed picture frame, a photo of his wife leaning against the hood of the car, smiling softly in the afternoon sun. As Edward drove into the park, the crowd fell silent, sensing something deeper than machines and chrome, love, memory, and a life preserved through every carefully polished detail. Rows of vintage cars lined the park, from Chevy Bel Airs and Ford Thunderbirds to Volkswagen Beetles. Each vehicle came with a story, displayed on small placards beside them. Some residents brought wedding photos, old love letters, even fragments of journals from loved ones long gone. It wasn't just a car show, it was a gallery of remembrance, where people allowed their truest, quietest emotions to step into the light. Karen arrived midway through the event, dressed in a sharp gray suit, clutching a stack of documents as if still hoping to exert control. Her eyes scanned the rows of cars, finally landing on Edward's Pontiac. "You are in violation of Clause 4.7, she declared. "This event was not approved by the HOA and will be subject to consequences." Edward said nothing. Before he could respond, an elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd, a long-time resident known for her quiet demeanor. But this time, her voice was clear and firm. "Karen, he hasn't violated anything. This is a public park, and if anyone here is violating the spirit of community, it's not Edward." A ripple of applause followed, not loud or wild, but steady and full of weight. Then came more clapping from the right, the left, and soon the entire park was filled with a wave of approval that couldn't be stopped. Karen looked unsettled, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands clenching the papers until they crumpled. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the back. "I propose a vote of no confidence." Everyone turned. It was Robert Lanning, a long, silent member of the HOA board, now standing tall, his eyes steady with resolve. "We've allowed rules to become tools of suppression rather than guidance. Willow Glen needs a change." Silence fell once more, then burst into enthusiastic agreement. A petition was drafted on the spot, signed, and publicly posted. And for the first time in years, Karen couldn't stop the tide she had once so tightly controlled. The event ended as the sun dipped low, casting a warm golden hue over the old cars and the beaming faces of people who had just rediscovered something they'd forgotten: their voices, their memories, and the freedom to be themselves. The week following the classic car event, Willow Glen was no longer the same. Something in the air had shifted, not the sky, not the trees, but the way neighbors looked at one another when they passed by. Their glances were no longer cautious, but warm, accompanied by gentle nods, as if they had all weathered an unseen, yet deeply significant trial together. Karen still showed up at HOA meetings out of habit, but she was now merely a faded shadow of the authority she once held. Her once commanding speeches were now met with pushback, questions, and even raised eyebrows from other board members. The vote of no confidence was finalized just 1 week after the event, and with an overwhelming majority, Karen was officially removed from her position as HOA president after nearly a decade in power. There were no cheers, no loud celebrations, just a quiet sense of relief, as though the neighborhood had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath under tight control. Instead of dwelling on the past, people began speaking about the future, revising outdated rules, introducing new clauses that respected personal heritage, and most importantly, putting people before policies. Edward didn't take part in these debates. He simply watched from a distance, offering a soft smile when neighbors, who once avoided his gaze, now walked up to greet him. One afternoon, he opened his garage door and found 4 children standing outside, staring in awe at the Pontiac. One boy turned and asked, "Mister, does it still run?" "It looks like something out of a movie." Edward chuckled, nodded, and opened the car door. Want to sit in it? The kids cheered and scrambled inside like they were entering a castle from a fairy tale. In their eyes, the car wasn't outdated. It was a gateway to another world, one where time wasn't measured by technology, but by feeling. A month later, the HOA elected a new president, Eleanor Shaw, a middle-aged former schoolteacher who had lived in Willow Glen for over 15 years. She lacked the commanding presence of Karen, but her words were always thoughtful and deliberate. In her first meeting, Eleanor said, "We have rules, and rules are important. But if those rules make people feel alone in their own homes, then it's time we change them." Under her leadership, the HOA began allowing exceptions for cultural and personal value. Heritage flags, garden art, and even vintage cars, if deemed meaningful and non-disruptive, were permitted. Edward, though not officially appointed, was widely considered the cultural advisor of Willow Glen and was often consulted on unique cases. One early winter evening, Edward drove his Pontiac through the neighborhood, not as a statement, but simply to breathe in the crisp air. Christmas lights twinkled from every porch, glowing like tiny flames warming the community's spirit. As he pulled up to his house, a young neighbor approached and said, "Thank you, Edward, for showing us that some things can't be measured by rules, only felt with the heart." Edward smiled, looking up at the starry sky. In the cold breeze, he could almost hear Margaret's soft laugh in his ear. "You see, you helped them remember who they are." On a weekend morning, just after a light rain had passed, the sun peeked through the clouds, and the air was fresh, with the scent of damp earth and a hint of jasmine wafting from someone's backyard. Edward stood quietly in his driveway, gently wiping the dust off the hood of his Pontiac with a soft cloth. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. He didn't need to do this every week anymore. The car was no longer a cause for fines, no longer a symbol of resistance. Now, it was simply a part of him, a piece of memory revived every time sunlight touched the metallic green paint. From the sidewalk came a child's voice. "Mr. Edward, I brought you something." Edward turned to see Max, the young boy who lived 2 doors down, running toward him, holding a crumpled sheet of paper. "I drew your car," Max said, catching his breath. "Our teacher told us to draw something that makes us happy, and I picked your Pontiac." Edward accepted the drawing, a slightly crooked but colorful picture of his old car shining under a starry sky. On the hood were 2 figures, an old man wearing a cap and an elderly woman smiling. His heart ached gently. "Do you know who she is?" he asked. Max shook his head. Edward smiled softly. "She's the reason this car exists." The boy paused, then asked, "Can the car fly?" Edward let out a full, honest laugh, his eyes misting with emotion. "No, kiddo, but it once took me and her farther than any airplane ever could, because it carried our dreams." Max nodded thoughtfully, then scampered off with his tiny feet, leaving Edward alone with the drawing, the car, and sunlight filtering through the leaves above. He looked down at the picture again, then up at the clear blue sky. Wisps of clouds drifted by, and for a fleeting moment, he could almost see Margaret standing beneath the porch awning, teacup in hand, eyes as gentle as ever. That day, Edward didn't roll the car back into the garage like usual. He left it out in the driveway, not as a protest, but as a quiet punctuation mark, a message that didn't need words. Some things, no matter how old, deserve to remain in sight, not because of how they look, but because of what they mean. That evening, as lights from neighboring homes flickered on, the Pontiac sat peacefully, like a silent sentinel guarding time itself. Passers-by slowed their pace. Some paused to take a closer look. A few even snapped photos. No one mentioned the HOA. No one remembered the citation from years past. Instead, they simply said, "That's Mr. Edward's car, the car of love." Elsewhere in Willow Glen, the community bulletin board now held a freshly printed flyer for a new annual event, the Festival of Memories and Classic Cars, celebrating the stories that shaped this place. Beneath it, in small italic print, "Not all memories are meant to be hidden. Some deserve to shine in the sun." And so, even as time marched on and autumns continued to come and go, people would remember the day when an entire neighborhood sat down together, Not for rules, but for a car, a man, and the things no one ever wanted to forget. Edward's story is more than a conflict between a man and a neighborhood association. It is a story about memory, dignity, and the importance of not remaining silent in the face of injustice. Many seniors will deeply resonate with Edward because we all at some point have held on to things that others saw as trivial, but to us, they held the essence of a life lived. The Pontiac wasn't just an old car, it was a symbol of love, a legacy of a faithful life, and the vessel that carried the story of Edward and his late wife. But modern society, with its rigid rules and indifferent gaze, often discards such things simply because they don't fit the aesthetic. That is when older generations must speak up, not to rebel, but to remind the world that some things can't be measured by standards only understood by the heart. This story also highlights the power of community. When Edward shared his story, he didn't accuse or demand. He simply told it with honesty and memory. And that truth stirred his neighbors. It helped them realize that they too had been hiding precious parts of themselves, afraid of judgment. When one person stands up, others find the courage to step out of silence. That's a powerful lesson. Age does not limit our ability to create change. In fact, seniors possess strength through experience, calmness, and patience, all qualities the world desperately needs. Additionally, the story underscores an essential truth. Rules should never replace compassion. A society needs order, but rules only matter when they serve people. When regulations are used to control or hurt, they must be questioned. Older adults, as those who've walked through history and carried communities, are uniquely positioned to remind others of fairness, humanity, and the importance of grace. In the end, Edward didn't change the world with power or technology. He did it with memory, resolve, and love. And that's something anyone, regardless of age, can do. Hold on to what matters, speak up when it's time, and never believe it's too late to make a difference. This story is a gentle reminder. The things we love, even when old and worn, are still worthy of respect. And sometimes it is the older generation, through quiet, seemingly simple acts, that preserves the spirit, memory, and conscience of an entire community.